Guys, you may have heard a famous anecdote of an American business executive who meets a Mexican fishing captain while on his fishing boat holiday, right? A long story short, he asked the guy, how'd you keep busy with your day? The Mexican guy says, Señor, in the morning, I wake up. Actually, it wasn't a very good Mexican accent, but...
I can't remember if accents are sort of forbidden nowadays. I have no idea.
Verboten, yes. But I spend my day, I wake up late, I spend time with my family. In the afternoon, I go fishing a little bit. I come back, I play checkers or chess with a friend, have some beers, chill, and I sleep ready for the next day.
What a day.
What
a life.
Well, the American man says, you fool. Sorry, Jake, I've ended up doing both the voices. He says, you fool.
That's fine.
Yeah, and the American man begins to lecture him, and there's a whole, if we do this properly, there'd be a whole series of escalating, like, if you fish twice as long, you'd catch as much fish, twice as much fish. And the man says, why should I do that? And he says, so you can hire more people. Why should I do that? So you can run a factory. Why should I do that? So you can run a corporation. Why should I do that? So I can IPO and make millions and millions. And he says, why should you do that? He says, well, I suppose so you can wake up late, go fishing in the afternoon, probably
you
chill with your friends and family. Yes, exactly. And the whole point of this anecdote is that, the whole point of the anecdote is that it's very similar to his current circumstance. Jake, we once heard this at a conference.
I was going to say, this was one of the funniest things that happened to us. We were at a business conference, and a great guy, he told this story. He's a sort of business leader of his own kind. He tells the story, and he gets to the end of the story, and he looks at an audience full of young entrepreneurs, and he says, so guys, what was the meaning of the story? And naturally, everyone sort of who puts their hand up says, well, it's about, finding meaning in the here and now and actually being content and being happy with what you've got.
Yeah, not losing sight of what matters.
Not losing sight of what matters, perfectly put. To which the guy goes, wrong! It's about the value of empire building.
Yeah, it was a hilarious anecdote to choose, not understanding the point.
But like, are you sure?
Yeah. Guys, welcome to the latest season of The Morality of Everyday Things. Excuse the long pause, we've been very busy, but we're here. We're going to be talking to you about happiness, as you might have understood from the anecdote, and I think we mentioned in the trailer. Reminder, we have a live meetup.
We're talking about empire building.
We're talking about empire building. We're meeting up in person on the 26th of June. Mark it in your calendars. It's a Wednesday in Southeast London Borough Central. Okay, so it's near
the Ministry co-working space.
In the Ministry co-working space. And then we'll hang out for drinks afterwards. Maybe I'll buy you a drink. Maybe you buy me a drink. That's you, the listener, not Jake. Jake, you can buy me a drink too, though.
Maybe. We'll see.
Jacob, any other intros, people? This is a podcast about everyday philosophy. Hopefully you have kind of gathered that by this point, or listened to one of the trailers.
If this is the first time you're listening to us, welcome. And the way we like to approach things is we'll take interesting everyday moral or philosophical topics, and we'll try and break them down. Take anything that's complex, break it down into stuff that's simple and understandable. We tend to start by defining what we're looking at sort of key thoughts in the space, but then really kind of debating it through what our perspectives are, and again, trying to take that everyday lens on where the truth lies. So welcome.
Exactly. Welcome. So this time we're going to be talking about happiness, this time and next time, and maybe the time afterwards. Sorry guys, despite being a philosophy podcast, we're actually maybe not going to touch that much philosophy. We're going to start going into the psychology, we're going to build the basis of the biology, and we'll touch on the different forms of happiness and why it's an interesting topic, before actually wrapping up with some practical advice. And then next time we're going to start jumping into like historical perspectives, philosophical perspectives, some modern theories around it. So without further ado,
we will get to the philosophy, but perhaps this episode, as you say, it's about taking the building blocks, isn't it? And it's looking at the I suppose anthropological. That's maybe the wrong word, but it's kind of taking that sort of survival-based approach and sort of where happiness scientifically comes from, and
exactly
how that has itself informed philosophy over the years.
Yes. But let's start with the key dichotomy highlighted by literature. So, one of my favorite authors, if you've been a long-time listener, you know that I'm a fan of Vonnegut. I'm also a big fan of Hemingway, though. Anyway, he tells an anecdote where he would often sit out on a summer's day, fish, drink lemonade. He was a kid. I don't know, different times, maybe drank beers. Who knows?
Maybe he was a Mexican.
Maybe he was a Mexican fisherman. It's whatever you imagine a sort of quaint family get-together around Cape Cod in the 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. I'm not 100% sure in his timeline. And he tells the story of supposedly he'd sit in the sun surrounded by his loved ones, And his uncle would have a typical refrain, which would be, if this ain't nice, I don't know what is, right? If this isn't nice, what even is nice? And I think it's, fairly synonymous to stretch this to, if this isn't, being happy, I don't know what is. I don't think that that's a big leap. And he tells this anecdote, and his advice at the end of it is to encourage people to take the time to notice when you are in fact being happy, when you're in the middle of happiness. A moment reflected upon is often deepened, after all. And that's a cute anecdote. But is it sound advice? Is something maybe missing when we give this advice, which focuses on this sort of content idea of happiness, and just focusing on our happy feelings? Or does it start to kind of introduce us to some sort of deeper dissonance of the human condition? Is it really so simple as just feeling happy? Has what we wanted all along, just existed, and the problem is that we're just not noticing it? Jacob, do you want to define that there?
So, happiness, as you're talking about there, it seems to be centering around a kind of definition of like pleasure or contentment or something like that. And if I take a moment to be slightly boring, there is a full definition I'll read. But I think this is useful because I think what it drives at is that happiness is more than just one aspect like pleasure or like contentment, but happiness is perhaps best understood as a subjective...
Way to jump ahead to the... But go ahead.
Well, as a subjective set of different possible things. And I think it's important to say this early because I think we'll come back to different aspects of this as we progress. So let me read you the definition. Happiness is a subjective state of well-being characterized by positive emotions, satisfaction, contentment, and a sense of fulfillment. It involves a balance of positive emotions like joy, pleasure, gratitude, and fulfillment, along with a general sense of life satisfaction and meaning. It can be influenced by various factors.
That's a big thing to just throw in there. A general sense of life satisfaction and meaning.
It's kind of like the good, isn't it, right? It can be influenced by various factors, including personal relationships, accomplishments, health, societal and cultural norms, and individual values and beliefs. And it's often pursued as a fundamental goal in life and can manifest differently for each individual. Just to really carve out more exceptions.
Wow. Just what an incredibly unhelpful definition. It's like happiness is feeling happy and this and this and this and the entire meaning and purpose of your life.
So I don't think we need to take this as the base. I think we abstract from this perhaps one understanding that happiness is not simply pleasure or contentment as per the Vonnegut anecdote, which we'll come back to. Happiness is kind of it's broader than that. What's interesting is this tries to kind of posit happiness as something subjective, and we'll see as we get into it, different people have over time debated that. Happiness could be subjective, but the Greeks were very keen on this idea that happiness is an objective state, and you can sort of look at a life and say that is a happy one and that is not.
Yes,
so that's interesting,
irrespective of how that person was feeling. Just on that anecdote we gave there, that in some ways seems to really jive with the times. There's the popularity of meditation and stoicism and mindfulness and all this. It's all this kind of perception of happiness. The root to happiness is letting go of everything, right? And I mean, if you think about that anecdote we told about the Mexican fisherman, it doesn't necessarily need to be Mexican, though. He could be a fisherman anywhere.
A Cape Cod fisherman.
Yeah. The truth is, and this is the funny thing, the truth is that is the zeitgeist. And yet, many of us are living in major cities in the developed world, and we could go and do that. We could pack it all up. We could go and be the Mexican fisherman. A lot of us could work remotely 5 or 10 hours a week and get by in these cheaper to live places. And yet we don't. There aren't these mass exoduses from New York and London and other cities. And so I want to contrast those ideas and to kind of touch a little bit on that definition that Jake gave and its sheer breadth. Let's look at another literary example where we talk about happiness. We'll talk about Ralph Waldo Emerson, right?
The man who wrote Walden, if I'm not mistaken.
He could have. He also could have written The Hungry Caterpillar. I don't know.
While you're talking.
I believe that is correct. I believe that's correct.
Oh, I'm wrong. Walden was by Henry David Thoreau, and he talks about Emerson in it. What did Emerson do?
Oh, yeah, which is the one of them lived out in a cabin in the middle of nowhere, right?
That was the Walden book.
But one of them actually also lived quite like that.
Ralph Waldo Emerson did write Nature, and he wrote Self-Reliance, titles which would both point to something like that being true. We'll have to check him out.
I think they're like, it's not a surprise that they refer to each other. They're fairly similar guys in intellectual thought. But his quote is, the purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived and lived well, right? And maybe that kind of explains why are people not running away from cities? Because there, in some sense, maybe we're able to fulfill that sort of idea. And he doesn't actually, he explicitly says the purpose of life is not to be happy, right? And yet, despite actually dismissing happiness, he's simultaneously advocating this life lived well. And it's funny because as biological creatures, we seem to be driven to pursue happiness, right? And I think that his point couldn't really be quite as appealing as it seems if we didn't at some level seem to understand that that was actually a route to happiness, right? But how can we discard happiness in the pursuit of being happy? That's the problem. And this is where we kind of come to this point earlier, Jake, you were talking about your definition, and it was a list of 20 things ranging from feeling good to the meaning of your life. And we actually soon realize that the problem of discussing happiness and, a general issue of semiotics, semantics, and, in many cases, is that we have reduced these super distinct and vast concepts into one word. And then
I think it's
we spend our lives. We spend our lives advising each other on how to be that concept.
And this is maybe a good time to quickly look at the etymology of the word happiness, because, as you say, this is 200 years ago or so that these guys were writing, or Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau were around. And happiness perhaps meant something slightly different back then. Perhaps it did refer more to the kind of pleasure that the utilitarians used to sort of define it. The etymology, the word happiness, has its roots in Old English, deriving from the word hap, which meant chance or fortune. So it's associated more with, I suppose, as in that would be a state of being unfortunate, right? Having no fortune. So Old English hap was kind of associated with luck or perhaps even fate. So there was a sort of more objective quality to it. It was more kind of like your circumstances are guiding the sort of state of your fortune, rather than perhaps in the modern era, we kind of bring more sense of choice to the whole concept when we talk about happiness. It does say in the etymology that over time happiness evolved to signify a state of well-being or prosperity influenced by the good fortune or favourable circumstances you sort of had around you. And this evolution reflects that happiness isn't solely dependent on external factors, but can be cultivated internally. And I think this is actually something where, if you were to sort of plot the arc of the definition, we've kind of reached that point more in the modern era where positive psychology and stuff like that really points to, you can exercise total control over your happiness, and it's something that you guide. And I think prior to that
as long as you buy my product that I'm advertising on Instagram.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that will be a point, right? Marketing plays a massive role. You mentioned the zeitgeist in the Vonnegut time, and now the sort of modern zeitgeist is you have to be ultra fit and healthy to have a chance at being happy, right? That's a sort of popularly marketed concept. So I think looping back from the etymology to what you were talking about, though, is the sense that perhaps back in their day, happiness more referred to sort of pleasure and nice circumstance, and less to this kind of sense of mindset or wider sense of sort of factors that contribute to happiness as we understand it. Perhaps the definition of happiness has grown broader over time, which makes it in some sense less meaningful, because, as you say, you can be sort of advising other people on how to be happy and talking at completely cross purposes. If one of you is talking about being resilient and the other one is talking about feeling, I don't know, like high on happiness, joy, contentment.
This is it. So I feel like, exactly. To discuss happiness, you first need to agree that it's too broad a term to discuss without, setting boundaries. And then it actually also becomes a question of like, okay, are we saying like of this kind of range of things, there's a few stances you can take, and we'll come to this in the philosophical part. Some people are like, this is the only part that matters. This is the only part that matters. And then the advice can be, okay, how to optimize, which part is the right part and how do you optimize on it? Or the advice could be, look, the truth is that happiness is a grappling match between these two sides. Here's where I think the synthesis is, and here's general advice for working out what to prioritize when and how to kind of come away from it. The problem is if I say coming away from it, like feeling like you've got the best out of your decisions, the problem is that does imply one over the other, which is a kind of more long-term looking back idea of happiness rather than
implies reflection one, right?
Yes, as the means to understanding whether you're happy, right?
Yeah.
But this is the thing, like the question is, perhaps these concepts aren't competing at all. Perhaps they are. Sorry, someone's trying to call me. Perhaps they're not competing at all. Perhaps they are. And actually the nature of advice should be, maybe less to tell you which part of it is the right part, and more how you find a synthesis. The problem is so many people who are talking about happiness end up just talking about one narrow part, and even then aren't really thinking about it in a kind of wider sense.
So is that our aim, man? Are we going to try and have that?
We're going to thread the needle. That's us. Done.
Cool. We'll find the middle road.
Yes. To read a specific written bit, this is a little ostentatious, but indulge me. So these literary anecdotes we gave, maybe they have nuggets of truth, but maybe the wisdom is in understanding this grappling match. And perhaps they're not competing, they're all necessary, but somehow contradictory. That's one part I hadn't mentioned. There's often a trade-off between these things, right? The fun now versus building the happy life, doing the virtuous thing.
I mean, a direct example of that would be a hangover, right? As in,
yes.
you drink, you have fun right now.
Boring fun.
Yeah, it's pulling fun forward in time at the expense of the future, and perhaps exercise is the opposite. You're pushing fun into the future with the sort of immediate suffering you're experiencing.
Exactly. And I think the extremes make it obvious, right? You can't be happy with a life devoid of meaning, or a life that's clearly not well lived. And yet if your life, if you're Mother Teresa and you're not one of those, rare saints, moral saints, that's actually a reference to
Susan Wolf, yeah.
Yes, Susan Wolf, who derives great joy from that. If your life never includes moments of happiness, it's hard to say that was a happy life as well, right? In fact, actually, Gandhi's a good example. Like, it seems hard to say that his was a happy life, right? Although, he seemed to enjoy his way of living, his ascetic lifestyle more than most. And if even the idea itself of the honorable life doesn't make you feel some sort of pride and hence happiness, something seems missing from that concept too. So maybe there's no generalized answer, not even a personally correct answer, but the best we can do is try to understand these different perspectives and find the path that satisfies us. Or you listen to our advice and it's totally perfect, we got it. So guys, that was kind of like laying out, I suppose, the next 2 or 3 episodes, the overall issue of happiness. And to put it in a sentence, it's too broad a concept, and most of the time when people are talking about it, we can't even agree if we're talking about a part of it and we should be saying happiness of this form, or some people are saying this is the only type that matters, or some people are saying here's how you balance them. Let's take a little detour. Sorry guys, if you're here for the philosophy, this is going to be more biology and psychology basically for the rest of this episode, and then we're going to wrap up for today.
We can weave in some philosophy into it, though. Because perhaps a really interesting example to illustrate the first point around happiness and biology is if we start with an anecdote from Brave New World. So Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, it's a great dystopian novel if you're unfamiliar with it, and it sort of talks about a future where humans are pretty much sedated into sort of happiness. Everyone has a kind of role in society, and everyone is fed the drug soma, which you've probably come across in popular culture. It features in a lot of songs. And in a sort of life on soma, you basically take this drug and it makes you happy. And the only meaning really in your life is that you sort of fulfill this predefined role in society. You're effectively a sort of cog in the machine. So it's really
you're actually assigned. You're assigned like I'm an A, I'm a B, I'm a like imagine
exactly.
When you work at a big corporation and they're like I'm a level 3 like band 2 accountant or whatever. That means if I work really hard, I could become a level 4. Like that is their entire. In fact, actually, you can't move up or down.
But you can't shift exactly.
Yeah. They actually also control people's genetics, and so like A through D, like your intelligence, your physical traits are defined by your caste, basically.
This is absolutely true. You're bred for your role in society. So there's no sort of intrinsic meaning that you can bring to life. You're sort of told your purpose, and then in the meantime, you're fed this drug soma, which basically, I suppose, it's been a while since I read it, but
happy orgy drug, if I recall.
That's it. Yeah, you're just sort of having happy dreams or whatever you're doing.
Sex parties. They all meet up and have, mindless, drugged up sex.
Cool. So that sounds horrible, obviously. The point I wanted to illustrate with this anecdote before we go into it is that soma is just purely about influencing the chemicals in your brain. It's this, it's just force feeding you this drug that sort of makes you think that you're happy, and most people in society just sort of crack on with that, and they seem to be happy and they don't question it. And then the big sort of plot theme in Brave New World is there's this one guy who's like, but there must be more to life than this, and he sort of rails against it. And I thought that was a good anecdote just to illustrate where we're going to first, which is happiness in biology.
Yeah, and to some extent, I guess happiness in biology, basically what we're saying, explains immediate term pleasure, but it struggles. We'll take that step up to psychology, and then it starts to talk about the kind of deeper sense. But when you hear that story of Soma and Brave New World, I feel like most people, your first thought is like, that doesn't actually sound very happy, right? But they are objectively happy all the time. And this is another thing we'll talk in the coming episodes, where it's the happy pig or Aristotle dissatisfied, right? Like the point of that outsider, I think his name's John or something like that, in the book.
John the Savage.
Yeah, John. That's it, John the Savage. The point is that he grew up outside of normal society. He wants this, like, he has this understanding that, like, to feel real happiness, connection, depth of emotion, because this is one of the things, they lack real connection to each other because they're all just drugged up. He's like, part of that is difficult, unnecessary, like difficult, strange, uncomfortable experiences not always being drugged up. And that actually, we kind of naturally, I assume, resonate with this, like, oh, like, yeah, actually, I'd rather be John. Okay, Jake, let's talk through some of the biology.
Okay, so we've got a few bullets here, and I'll read through the beginning. The modern study of psychology often has increasing overlaps with our understanding of biochemistry and neuroscience. So let's assess happiness a little from this perspective. Yep. First off, why do we even... Sorry,
First bit's kind of anthropological.
Yeah. So firstly, why do we even feel happiness at all? And I suppose a boring answer to that is that it is probably linked to our survival from the sort of evolutionary perspective of how we developed. Happiness is essentially part of our reward system, and it encourages us to form bonds, to mate, and rewards survival behaviors. So, like, you eat fruit, it's sweet, you feel happy. That's obviously been, ruined by sort of modern sugary food that are really unhealthy for you, but tap into that same kind of chemical response, right?
Yeah. We'll come into that. Yep. So in terms of how that is actually done, like, okay, why do we feel happy physiologically? Probably evolution, or ancient aliens, or God, or God is an ancient alien. But in terms of how, we're basically looking at this, like, complex interplay of neurochemicals and brain regions. So even in biology, happiness is not just one thing or clear cut, because there are many different neurochemicals which factor into you being happy, and they make you feel happy in slightly different ways.
So this isn't a biology podcast, of course, but Ant, do you want to give us the highlight sort of list of these chemicals?
We'll try go quick, but, like, to name some of them: dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, oxytocin, right? Like, those are all things you probably heard about. Dopamine, linked to your brain's reward system, gives you feelings of pleasure when we engage in enjoyable activities, like scrolling on social media or listening to this podcast or eating chocolate.
The social media one, I was going to say, that was a big thing that, like, the algorithm design teams were like, okay, how do we tap into that dopamine response? The like button, when people see that their content is getting approval, it triggers something.
Yeah. Serotonin, again, not a biology podcast, but seems to play a crucial role in regulating our moods. And it's often focused on treating depression, like raising your levels of it, right? Also helps with sleep. Endorphins, this is to do with stress and pain. And actually, like, it can be a reward system for doing things that are stressful or painful, but you get this euphoric feeling. It's often referred to as a natural high.
That's it. People often talk about that with exercise, right? You'll have sort of personal trainers will say after a hard session, like look out for that endorphin rush, and and perhaps you feel it, perhaps you don't. But
and then obviously oxytocin, known for its role in social bonding. That's the one that you get when you have, like, skin to skin contact. That's the kind of the love hormone, I think people normally would say, but love in that kind of, like, immediate, not in that deep sense. Love may be another one that we touch in this coming series. Definitely some interesting stuff from Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, and that.
I think part of the reason it's called the love hormone is that it's meant to be triggered immediately after sex, right? And that's
I would think during, because you're making contact, right? Because you get it when you hug.
Yeah. And it's.
I mean, I wouldn't know. I've never had it, but.
Well, so I'm told. You get this release of it during or after sex.
No, I think that's part of what's.
It's part of what's supposed to, as you said, it sort of drives social bonding. In theory.
So one thing that's important here is, like, even in our biological makeup, it seems that when we talk about happiness, that it reflects the fact that there are actually different kinds of happiness, because there are different hormonal responses that we seem to associate with happiness, right? So I again, not a biology podcast, but to put it this way, momentary pleasures, and, a feeling of a sense of pride, we would both kind of, if we're not in a highly technical circumstance, describe as I'm feeling happy. And yet these are actually very different hormonal cocktails, right? So next, that's talking about the hormones. Finally, interestingly, despite our focus on hormones and the conscious experience, the impacts of happiness seem to run deep in our genes and also have knock-on impacts on our whole bodies. So reducing stress hormones such as cortisol can in turn have positive effects on physical health. It can include improve your immune function and cardiovascular health. And we've also seen that effectively, partially through this, studies have linked happiness to a stronger immune system, living longer, being less likely to die of heart disease.
I've seen that before as well about happiness influencing recovery. So you recover faster when you're sort of happy, and they talk in hospitals about like having a positive mindset being kind of key to recovering fast. Yep. So I could believe that. So what you're saying here is that happiness has a kind of genetic component.
It does. So happiness is strongly associated with our genetic makeup as well. There does seem to some extent, be a sort of baseline happiness we feel. Take it from anyone who has a history of depression in their family, like your body's ability to regulate or the amount of certain hormones that it creates or how responsive your brain is to those hormones are all genetic factors. In fact, Sonia Lyubomirsky of UFC Riverside, University of California, Riverside, suggests that about 50% of happiness is really down to genetics, which would be how responsive you are to hormones, how you create those hormones, etc., etc. 10% is circumstance, and 40% is probably down to choices. So
I'd love to know how she broke up the. I'd love to know how she broke up those percentages. That'd be interesting.
People love headlines, man. People love reading the title of studies, no more.
50% genetics, 40% choices, 10% circumstances, and 100% reason to remember the name. Sonia Lyubomirsky.
100% difficulty as well.
100% difficulty remembering the name. Before we move on from that, I was just going to sort of hit that point. So the genetic point is actually really interesting because that seems to imply there's kind of natural limits on, again, obviously we're talking about the sort of chemical aspect of happiness. So that's the kind of in the moment experienced pleasure or pain or stress or all the kind of emotional factors. It may also be
your experience of it though, right? Because it's also the interplay of how those hormones affect you, how receptive you are to certain hormones.
That's true. So it's in the moment you experience it, and then I suppose that influences your reflection on that too, right? So and kind of, I guess, double effect.
Part of the problem of all of this is that, like, ultimately it comes to that, like, classic philosophical problem where it's like we can't 100% be sure how other people are feeling, right? So your baseline happiness might feel different to someone else's baseline happiness. The same way, the classic example, not the same thing, but another similar problem would be like, what you see as green could be what I see as blue, and there is just no way for us to know that because there's no way of us checking someone else's lived experience.
Yeah, just to link that to philosophy, that's Wittgenstein's beetle in a box problem for anyone who's familiar with that. And if you're not, it's what Ant just described. It's the fact that you can talk about this, you have a sort of beetle, but it's hidden in a box and no one else can see it. And what you describe as a beetle, someone else has a beetle in their box, and you might sort of semantically agree on having the same thing, and yet the actual underlying experience could be completely different and exactly what Ant's just saying. We are using words as an ineffective means to communicate a very personal experience and sort of try and generalize it, and we can agree, but in some respects it's impossible to ever know whether we seem to, when we talk about happiness, kind of be united on the fact that this is a good thing. So there seems to be a kind of common thread to this that's like, the lived human experience, we have all these things in common, but perhaps there's a semantic problem there. Famously, that was Wittgenstein's whole thing, right? He was like, actually, all of philosophy comes down to problems of semantics. Therefore, philosophy is pointless. Therefore, I have solved philosophy, to paraphrase horribly his kind of first major thesis. And then he came back and did more stuff because he was very, very clever.
The semantics of that was obviously a nonsense, because that itself. But yes. Now, guys, this is
biology. Yeah.
Yeah. The reason we included these bridges, and they actually seem to relate, was because there is this kind of interplay where, like we said, biology seems to reflect the fact that there's many types of happiness. We're going to move up the conceptual ladder and focus more on frameworks of understanding different types of happiness from a psychological perspective, a academic psychological perspective, and understanding how these can help us optimize. So firstly, in terms of psychology of happiness, the most relevant schism to discuss is between psychological perspectives of eudaimonia, and hedonism. Eudaimonia. And hedonism. Which, in a short phrase, kind of encapsulates the problem we highlighted in that intro around, Ralph Waldo Emerson's quote around, forget happiness. It's about a life well lived, effectively, versus the enjoying yourself as a fisherman, like why build an empire, sort of moments of pleasure perspective.
It's exactly that. It's like, do you kind of go out into the world and build this fishing empire and look back and say this was a life filled with achievement, or do you sort of fish within your means and needs every day and kind of be comfortable and happy and sort of enjoy time in the sun?
And both of these names come from ancient Greek, and I like to put it this way: eudaimonia refers to the sense of if you looked back on your life as a ghost, would you feel pleased? Would you feel a sense of pride? Is there some objective way that you can say like this was a good life? This was and that's that interplay between like the good life and a happy life is important there. Certainly, like virtue kind of links those. And then the second one is hedonism. It's like literally feeling pleasure. Like, did you have a good time? And I want to also clarify that like having a good time, it becomes too wrapped up. People often erroneously start to just make it synonymous with like, did you party and do drugs? Like, no, it means more. It can be meant more in the sense of like the Mexican fisherman. Like, did you focus on day to day, like just enjoying yourself? Right? Like short term, not thinking long term, like, oh, I need to do things that I need to feel proud of or that are important, right? So don't necessarily conflate hedonism, which we colloquially use usually to mean like reckless pleasure seeking, with like a idea of happiness that prioritizes, immediate pleasure.
I have a funny anecdote on this because a famous sort of, I wouldn't say he's necessarily about sort of hedonism, but Epicureanism, I think is sort of often colloquially understood as kind of prioritizing pleasure. And Epicurus himself is funny because he was the very opposite of sort of like party. He thought the highest form of pleasure was sitting around under a tree eating dry bread. Debating with friends the sort of merits of philosophy.
And that's
but it's like you said, right? Yeah.
It's about having immediate fun rather than like, oh, I don't know, I should be working because, being successful is important to having a life I'm proud of, right?
Perhaps it's a time horizon thing. Perhaps it's a time horizon thing. Do you think that's a fair definition there? Is it about sort of pleasure is experienced now versus pleasure is experienced in the future? Because a lot of when you're working is for that sort of ability to look back and feel proud of what you've achieved. Yeah. Whereas if you're, I don't know, having a drink with friends or whatever.
No, it's fair. I think the point is that like when we're talking about pursuing pleasure as your primary goal, hedonism, you can still be like a midterm hedonist or even a long-term hedonist. But the point is that you're not optimizing to feeling proud or doing the right thing or feeling good or feeling a great sense of purpose. You're optimizing to how will I have the most, how will I enjoy myself most? And the reason I say that is just to clarify that it is not synonymous with being reckless, because being reckless is being a bad midterm to long-term hedonist.
Okay, I see where you're going, but you're still saying forget virtue, forget pride. It's still all about pleasure. So actually, there's a good argument to say that long-term hedonism would emphasize health and fitness and well-being, so that in your sort of later years, you still feel the sort of pleasure that comes just from being healthy when you wake up in the morning.
And it could also be, it kind of reflects more the kind of the mindset of like, I go to the gym but I eat pizza,
I get you. I think.
It's like okay, that like I enjoy this and it's in the moment and it's like that's clear, but I also understand that like I'm optimizing to being able to eat pizza for the next 10 years. I enjoy occasionally a big night out. I understand that if I do it too frequently, actually it's reckless. Like I'm not thinking, just 1 hour ahead, right? I'm thinking 2 years ahead. And actually like, going out with my friends and eating what I want and stuff is part of that. But like, I need to balance that in the interest of, feeling good, going out with my friends, blah, blah,
blah. It's the balance is the key point there. But not you, of course, because you hate pizza.
I hate pizza. It's not even a food, it's a snack. Now, the interesting thing, talking high level about psychology, which I alluded to earlier, is that for many in psychology, one of the understandings is simply that these concepts both exist and both are important. So there is no dichotomy here, right? Like it's like, oh, like this is true, this is also true. And And, rather than, as some philosophers do, grappling over which is more important, or whether one is not relevant to real happiness, they kind of just accept that they're just distinct concepts. One notable detractor is Dr. Ed Diner, Dr. Happiness, he's sometimes called, who instead posits...
Really? What a cool title.
Yeah, who instead posits that... who does take up that fight, and posits that happiness is subjective, and more about a general sense of satisfaction with life rather than just experiencing frequent positive emotions, which does sound closer to the kind of good life well lived mandate. But it perhaps drifts in the middle, since a highly meaningful life could be extremely challenging and preclude a general sense of satisfaction, because he specifically said a general sense of satisfaction, right?
Can I ask on that? I mean, they're necessarily a trade-off between the two. I'm not sure there is, and I think when you were saying it's a false dichotomy, that's what you meant, right? Like it doesn't necessarily have to be that you don't have pleasure now to have a life well lived. They can sort of exist simultaneously.
This is the thing, and this is kind of the practical life advice, is that is probably true. But I think the kind of idealized high version of it is like, look, if only one of these things matters, you should either be Gandhi or a party animal, right? And this is... I keep talking about Gandhi. Gandhi was a party animal. No. I think that the thing that people often miss here is just this idea that, like, it's hard to incorporate both and say they're both important. And yeah, I keep turning to him, but like Gandhi, Mother Teresa would be maxing out the, like, hey, looking back, life I could be proud of. And yet most of us would agree their lives kind of suck.
Well, not necessarily. But you're saying we could all
choose to live very similar lives, and we don't.
Well, that's possibly because it's difficult without necessarily being totally unpleasant. An interesting aspect of what they do, and that does link to the sort of Greek perspective, is they've they've certainly optimized to legacy, right? Like whether that was intentional or not. I think a big part of the Greek...
I don't know that they did. I don't know if that was a big part of their thinking.
I'm not sure whether it's intentional or not either. I just know that the Greek perspective really valued that sense of, like, you want to live beyond your death. That was a big part of a virtuous life, was a life that was worth sort of further commentary after you died, and those are two people you've picked out. Is the reason you're talking about them being not necessarily sort of type 1 happy, or the first type that you were talking about, perhaps type 1 happy actually means something? Is it just this sort of notion that must have been a difficult road? Not a
particularly, like, pleasurable life. Like, Gandhi was very ascetic. Oh, actually, so was Mother Teresa. She was a nun. But both of them highly meaningful lives. So, I just want to say that that's what I mean when, like, normally some people imply there's a dichotomy. I think in reality, like you said, you kind of could and should have both, and it's about where you balance it.
It's about having your cake and eating it.
Yeah, but the part of it with like with so many things in life, it depends whether there's linear trade-offs, right? It could be that by going really hard on one, you get non-linear returns to it, right? So if, for example, I don't know, you want to be remembered, right? And I don't know, your way of doing it is being a sportsman, focusing 75%, but not taking that good care of your diet and stuff. Like, actually, the marginal difference could be enough to stop you being a superstar versus very average. I don't know. I'm not very well explained there, but you get the point. Let's continue with the psychology.
Yeah.
So
go for it. On
the other hand, I'd said, very few psychologists, but Dr. Happiness does. Very few psychologists generally say there's a dichotomy here, right? On the other hand, some people don't just acknowledge these two types of happiness, but they actually posit more of them. So Martin Seligman, who's often referred to as the father of positive psychology, identifies happiness as a positive experience, i.e. not just the absence of negative emotions, and specified 3 components or types. So hedonistic, he identified 3 components or types. One was hedonistic or hedonic. The second one was meaning, which I think we can take to be this kind of like life well lived sort of idea. But then another one was engagement, which I think people will hear this. We haven't mentioned it to this point, but when you hear it, you're like, oh, yeah. And that's to do with deep involvement in activities. And by considering these components, there is something of an implication that each is necessary. Now, this engagement, I think this has been touched on by several people. One famous person, and you'll recognize this term in a second, is Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. It's a very hard name to say. But he coined this concept of flow. And basically, it's this actually flow is also a state of happiness when you're being super focused on something. And that's now like, flow states. How do I get into a flow state? And microdosing to get into a flow state. That's all very well-known stuff. And we've all had that where you're really focused on something you care about, and it is actually a very enjoyable experience. So those are the three they put forward.
You're totally immersed, right, to the sort of complete exclusion of what's going on around you. It could be playing a game, it could be doing work, reading a great book, whatever it is.
And then one other psychological perspective that's super interesting. Very famous guy, Dr. Daniel Gilbert. Super interesting dude. Listen to his TED Talks. Listen to his podcast talk with the guy from the Freakonomics podcast. He describes happiness as more of a part of our psychological immune system, quote unquote, and that actually healthy people are predisposed to feel happy no matter what. He gives a very famous example of, people who become handicapped. Normally, their happiness returns to their normal level over time. Likewise, people who win the lottery, their happiness actually returns to a normal level, or sometimes gets worse because it kind of messes up their lives over time. But even then, they get used to the worst and it equilibrates. So your happiness just naturally balances, and largely where it balances is determined by your genes. Maybe this whole discussion of happiness as a reward for a great life is one big misunderstanding. And actually, anthropologically, evolutionarily, happiness is more like breathing. It's just part of the apparatus functioning well that is your body.
Super interesting. Okay. So that kind
That's not very helpful advice, though, right?
Yeah, well, we haven't got to the practical part yet, but that's the sort of summary of the psychology. It's interesting because, in that we've introduced the kind of pleasure versus virtue.
The good life, virtue.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to call it a dichotomy now, but we've introduced the fact that those have traditionally tended to be the kind of two definitions.
Yeah.
It reminds me actually, which is
dichotomy.
Yeah, it reminds me, which is a small tangent, of the way that recently economists have tried to study happiness. So what they've tended to do as their sort of methodology is split by those two approaches and the questions they'll ask, because ultimately happiness is a really hard thing to measure, and so you have to ask questions and sort of gather it subjectively. The questions they tend to ask is, day to day, like, are you happy? Would you describe yourself as a happy person? And then reflecting on your life, would you say your life, how would you rank your life satisfaction? And so the way they tend to drive at that distinction is a kind of like longer term retrospective reflection versus a kind of like day to day, how happy are you? Which is interesting.
Also, funny note, and we'll come to this in later episodes in the season when we talk about economics. Famously, a lot of the countries that top the happiness charts, places like Kenya, are not the most economically developed. The USA, despite being the biggest economy, is not anywhere near the top of that happiness chart. But talking about topping that happiness chart, to end this episode, we're going to be super quick with this one because you can look all this stuff up. And to be honest, none of it's going to be totally groundbreaking. But one of the nice things we said that we have these caveman bodies. We're going to look at some practical ways to increase happiness before exploring the philosophical ideas next time. I mentioned that our physical hardware to feel happiness is a little outdated. So Jake gave the example of we want to eat cake, right? We crave sugar because it makes us happy because that made sense when we were cavemen. It doesn't make sense when you have a supermarket full of cookies, right? But sometimes this also isn't that bad of a thing. Much like how we can induce optical illusions, taking advantage of our, old-fashioned eye hardware, and software. I'm using hardware and software to mean bodies and brain turning it into conscious experience. We can actually develop habits and physical practices to be happier that take advantage of the fact that, like it or not, our body just responds to those things in a certain way that is outside of our control. Jake, you want to talk through a few examples? None of these should be groundbreaking, but we'll just list them out.
I can list them. And what we're talking about here, I suppose, is almost like a sort of biohack, right? It's kind of life hacking the way that happiness is experienced in our bodies. So let's go into it. Gratitude journals. Is this something you've ever done, Ant?
Personally, no. I haven't felt the need.
Can't say I have either. But, stats show that gratitude journals have been shown to increase happiness, and I suppose what that's driving at is that gratitude journals force us to reflect on the things that are good in our life, and that is, just by doing that exercise alone, I imagine it sort of induces that reflective state of actually things are pretty good. Another one, which I do buy into big time, is people engage in regular physical activity. And there's a stat here that says when you exercise regularly, you have a 20 to 30% lower risk of depression and dementia for adults, which is cool. I've heard that too. I've heard more anecdotally than statistically, but I've heard that running and other sort of regular physical activity is a great way of treating depression as well. It sort of,
or at least
because there's a sort of,
or at least improving.
Yeah. Treating perhaps is too strong, but it's recommended. And you've got here a little note that says how it helps is it's partly down to the sort of endorphin hormone we were talking about earlier. Exercise increases endorphin levels, but it also improves sleep, reduces anxiety, and enhances cognitive function. So all of that makes sense.
Yep.
We have one more here.
Sort of connected. There's a bunch more around CBT, meditation, mindfulness, all of these tons of studies, and they can show like the impact it has on your brain. And what's the name of the part where that it shuts down the? It's the bit that's like supposed to do nothing. Well, like chill. It doesn't matter. Look it up, guys. We're not actually like trying to give you tons of practical advice. It's just, hey, there's a bunch of studies that say this. Another one, strength of social connections can actually improve your likelihood of living longer by 50%, according to that very famous Harvard study, the longitudinal one where they follow people post-graduation. It's not money. It's not anything else. Like strength of social connections, and hence part of the way that works is it makes you happy, and it seems to actually help you live longer. Helps you bond with people, reduce stress, create a sense of belonging and security. So that's, again, touching that kind of like life well lived. Part of that is through social connection.
I have a related link to this, which is the show about blue zones. I believe you watched it, right? Mm-hmm. I know we've talked about it. And for any listeners who are unfamiliar, there's a great show about sort of people who live to 100, and this researcher went around 4 or 5 places in the world where people regularly live over 100, and he looked at their lifestyles to try and understand what was going on here, and it did seem to be the case. So there's a kind of, the causal link might be the wrong way around in what I'm about to say, but it did seem to be the case that these people who were living quite a long time tended to be happy, or tended to be fairly happy. And he broke down 4 factors that are fairly similar to the ones we've talked about here. There was a whole factor on sort of diet, and he looked at what their diets had in common, and in general it was sort of what you'd expect, kind of fairly natural foods, eating in moderation. He looked at exercise. This one was interesting, just because I feel like it contradicts the sort of fairly modern zeitgeist we have around like regular or intense exercise. But he found that regular, moderate or light exercise was key. So a lot of these communities did exercise into their lifestyles because they were shepherds
and stuff.
They were shepherds or farmers, or they kind of exactly walking up hills. After we watched it, every time I walked up a hill when I was with Leah, I'd just be like, longevity, just to drive her crazy. But just a great way to motivate yourself up hills. So exercise, big one. That was the second theme. The third one, the social one, is exactly like you were saying with the Harvard study. This was really striking, was that all these communities had that fairly close-knit traditional community feel, and people really depended on each other and provided for each other and socialized regularly. So that was really cool.
Party.
And then the fourth one that is missing from this, but it's sort of related, is around purpose. And he said even to the age of 100, people never really like stopped doing stuff. They all knew that they provided some value to their community and they had something to get up for every day. And that I thought was also like a really striking point, which was just that I think when you think about the American discussion that we began this whole episode with the guy saying, build this empire, make loads of money, retire, and then do nothing, that seems to live in contrast with the sort of fisherman's original intention of, living a fairly modest, moderate life, but you've always got something to go out for and do every day until you're old, and you're fishing for yourself, for other people, for your community.
That is so true. People, we talk about, this dream of retiring, but the idea of doing nothing for 30 years doesn't, actually sounds like, well, first of all, a lot of studies show it does lead to mental health decline, but like dementia, much more likely, but also, happiness. So yeah, I mean, I could see that maintaining a sense of purpose actually could also, not just increase your lifespan, but also make you happier.
I might be wrong, but I imagine that the concept of retirement came about because
it was when you had like 2 years.
It was when you did fairly hard, intense manual work, and then you were only expected to have a few years before you died anyway. So it's
don't get me wrong. Like having a few years rest before death is okay, right? But nowadays that's not at 60.
Yeah. So I think that changes it. Anyway, that's a list of the sort of practical ways to enhance happiness. As Ant said, there's loads of literature on this online. But what does it all mean when it's talking about happiness? What kind of happiness is it really guiding you to? And I guess that's the question that we still need to properly pin down an answer on. But we've made a start. And we've got the building blocks of what it all means.
You understand the core tension and effectively what the problem of happiness is. Guys, that's it for the first episode. That's the context. Next time we'll start looking at some specific historical perspectives. We kind of naturally include it anyway, but we'll also give you a little bit more about what our views are as we go. And then we'll wrap it up and we'll get on to the next episode. Guys, thank you so much for listening. A reminder, 26th of June, in person, Borough. I will try and get a link where you can book to attend. And it'd be great to see as many of you there as possible. And please do join the WhatsApp if you want to find out more.
And if this is your first time listening, welcome. Please like and follow. I know every podcast says that.
That helps a lot.
Obviously,
and leave a review.
It does help. Yeah, we haven't been recording much until now, so it's great to be back. But it's important for us to remind you of that too. But I hope you liked it. Do leave us feedback. We're actively on the WhatsApp group, so we will reply to everything that you say. And we're starting to foster it as a place where debates are happening anyway. So that's a lot of fun.
Speak soon, guys. Much love. Bye-bye.